Hello everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome. My name is Dr Tom Alves. I'm the Head of Development at the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, known as AHURI, and I'm delighted to welcome you today to this AHURI Research webinar. I want to acknowledge, first of all, that I am hosting this webinar from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the many lands that each of you are joining us from today. I also acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be participating in this webinar also. I pay my respects to elders, past and present, and celebrate the diversity and ongoing connections of the Aboriginal people and their connections to the lands and waters of Australia. Before we commence today's webinar, I am pleased to announce that the National Housing Conference will be held on Wednesday the 2nd to Friday the 4th of March 2022, and for the first time this will be both an online and an in-person event. Early bird registrations will be closing shortly, so please be sure to register quickly, and you can see the website details on the screen in front of you now. Before I introduce today's topic and the speakers, I need to provide you with a few instructions on the software that we're using and give you some housekeeping and let you know how you can participate in the webinar today. This webinar is being recorded, so if you want to return to it later or to share it with a colleague, the recording will be available in coming days. You will receive a survey at the end of the webinar, and we welcome your feedback so that we can continue to refine and improve the webinars that we offer and ensure that we're presenting information that is relevant and interesting to you. In terms of how you participate in today's webinar, here are our instructions. You will have the opportunity to submit questions by typing them in the Q&A function, which you'll see just to the right of your screen, and you can submit your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collate these and we'll seek to address as many of them as we can after the presentation today. Please start putting your questions in as soon as you like, and we will begin that process of collating them. Now on to today's topic and presenters. I'm very delighted to welcome you to this webinar today, which is called Social Housing Asset Management in Australia. Our main presenter today is Dr Andrea Sharam from RMIT University. Andrea is the lead author of AHURI's report towards an Australian social housing best practice asset management framework, which examines social housing asset management in Australia and develops a best practice framework that outlines asset management processes and the criteria for making decisions. The report that Andrea has been the lead author for, along with the policy evidence summary and a standalone executive summary, are now available on the AHURI website, and they can be downloaded from there. They are also available in the handout section of the screen, and you'll see just next to the Q&A function, there's a handouts part of the interface that you have today, and you can go there and look at the report and the other materials as well. Dr Andrea Sharam is a senior lecturer at RMIT's School of Property, Construction and Project Management. Previously, she held several housing-related roles, including as a project officer with the Community Housing Federation of Victoria. She was also an elected representative on the Urban Planning Committee of a large inner Melbourne council. Today, we also welcome Jess Pomeroy, who will provide a response following the research presentation. Jess is Manager of Policy and Projects at CHIA, that's the Community Housing Industry Association, Victorian chapter, which is the peak body for community housing in Victoria. Her work involves translating and contributing to policy development across a wide range of issues that face the community housing sector. The format for today's webinar will include the research presentation from Andrea, and that will be followed by a short industry response from Jess. And then after that, I will facilitate a discussion between our two participants and also with you, the audience, by asking your questions of our two presenters today. So again, please do start putting your questions in as soon as they've come into your mind. And that includes during the presentation that Andrea's given. You can type your questions in. It is now my pleasure to introduce Andrea Sharam and to hand over to her to present her research. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you, Tom, and hello to everyone watching today. I also would like to make an acknowledgement of country. RMIT University acknowledges the people of the Woiwurrung and Boiwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations, on whose unceded lands we conduct the business of the university. And the university respectfully acknowledges their ancestors and elders past and present. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands on which our virtual seminar is being held today. The project team included myself, obviously, as the leader, Sean McNellis and Terry Burke from Swinburne University, and Joe Cho and Peter Rossini from the University of South Australia. So the overarching question that we were pursuing for this research is, what is a suitable best practice asset management framework for social housing in Australia? So we wanted to know what principles and processes should guide a best practice guide framework, and what specific and unique attributes of social housing that need to be understood to be incorporated into a best practice asset management framework. And of course, we wanted to know what the unique and specific features of social housing providers are that need to be recognised. And of course, we did also want to understand what was occurring within social housing organisations within Australia to understand, the practices and the current challenges. But a good place to start, of course, is with definitions. So asset management refers to the systemic management of any physical asset or portfolio of assets. So, the goal of asset management is to meet a required level of service in the most effective manner through the management of the assets for the present and for future customers. So social housing asset management is about stewardship of physical assets over their entire life cycle. So it's concerned with extending those assets to maximise the financial investment in them. It's also about ensuring those assets are fit for purpose both now and into the future, and are able to deliver a broad range of beneficial outcomes to both tenants and to society in general. The methodology for the project involved a literature review of Australian and international literature. We held a number of workshops with social housing organisations, both online and face-to-face, given our transitions during COVID. So we asked various stakeholders within social housing organisations to inform us about those specific and unique attributes of social housing provision in Australia. We undertook a national survey of providers, and we followed that up with 23 interviews with 28 senior managements to get reflections on the findings that we had and bring that extra layer of analysis and insight. So social housing is a unique asset class. So when we think of property, corporate real estate, social housing is particularly complex because it requires a social return in addition to a financial return. The financial returns are very low, but the social returns need to be very high. There really is a lack of a price signal, which would be the thing that would drive decision-making within corporate real estate. Social housing organisations have diverse stakeholder interests, and those interests often are using it for diverse purposes, not merely social, but sometimes it's economic, like in the current situation where we have a lot of economic stimulus money coming through the sector. And of course, providers have to be accountable to the government and community, not simply to shareholders or private owners. But having said all that, social housing actually operates predominantly within private markets, which term many variables, things like the land prices, the construction is often done through contracting, house prices and rents impact the demand for social housing. So the unique aspects of social housing provision in Australia. We are among a handful of nations who have income-based rents, and this is the means by which affordability is achieved. But the result of this, in the absence of any compensating mechanism, is a large financial gap in provision. So the incomes for organisations do not match what their actual costs are. So the main mechanisms through which our social housing organisations access capital funding is really through irregular or ad hoc capital grants. And the economic stimulus money is an example of that. And we had the same occur during the global financial crisis. And so that focus tends to be on growth rather than thinking about the existing portfolio and what those needs are. Australia has a very small population and low population densities and a large land mass. So we have many very small remote communities, for example. But in fact, our cities where most of us live are also quite low density, and that has challenges for asset management as well. We have a federal political system which has a very entrenched vertical fiscal imbalance, which translated, what that means is the Commonwealth, it raises most of the funds through taxation, but the states traditionally are those who are doing all the spending. So it requires bilateral funding agreements. And while housing, there was a consensus around housing for a very long time, in recent decades, that has been very challenging. Australia, of course, is a post-colonial settler society. We have Indigenous communities ranging from the Torres Strait through down to Tasmania. Now, Indigenous peoples in Australia experience very significant disadvantage, including very high rates of homelessness, overcrowding, and a very high reliance on social housing. And a fair proportion of that is actually substandard. There's been no treaty in Australia to help drive the kind of outcomes in housing that we would prefer to have. Within Indigenous communities, there's very diverse land tenures and there's community ownership. And these are also quite challenging for obtaining funding. The Australian social housing system is very old, so we have an ancient portfolio. Most of that housing is in the public sector. What is it worth? We don't really know. The figures are pretty rubbery, but let's say 100 billion. But most of that is actually the value of the land. So it suggests there's a very large liability that it sits there. Our public housing authorities are subject to broader public sector borrowing limits. So our public assets are not leveraged, unlike those in the community housing sector. And that's an opportunity that's really going to waste. We have a highly residualised social housing sector. So, allocations and targeted towards highly disadvantaged with multiple needs. And on top of that, we have the demographics, which are the growth of lone person households. So there's more demand for smaller housing rather than family housing. So best practice social housing asset management. So it involves a framework, which is the thing that we did develop one, and it involves an asset management plan. And of course, together they are going to consider all the social, economic and cultural and environmental factors. So that's, taking that kind of SWOT analysis, both internal and external. So the framework is a living document, and it's going to contain the policy, the strategy, and the plan, so that the why, the how, and the what. Your policy encompasses organisational policy, so internal and external policies. Strategies are going to show how the asset management is going to add to those policy outcomes. And it's going to include things such as having targets and improvement plans. The plan is an operational guide. Policy and strategy and programs all must be aligned, and they all must be transparent. Policy, strategy, and plans, though, they are organic and they need to change with the environment. So as the political landscape and the economy change, and how legal and social and technology settings change, the social housing business must be able to respond to them. And when we say, it's a living document, it needs to be completely embedded in the organisation at all times. So it shouldn't be, as what we found, is organisations do a plan and then it goes to the bottom drawer and they don't see it again for 3 years. That's not what it should be. So the asset management plan needs to contribute to the organisation's goals and objectives, and it needs to show that alignment between the strategy, the tactics, and the operational planning, and represent optimal programs of work. It needs to be very transparent and defensible. So, it needs to be signed off by the board, and the organisation needs to show how it's achieving those things. So if I, restate those things in a slightly different way, an asset management should be clearly derived from the corporate strategic plan. There are long-term whole of life plans, and these are cost, risk, and performance, concern the cost, risk, and performance. Objectives and performance measures must be aligned and complementary. All the systems should be integrated, used, and understood. And asset management requires many systems and connections between systems. Competencies and training should be aligned to roles, responsibilities, and collaborative requirements. Strategies need to be risk-based with appropriate use of predictive methods and optimized decision-making techniques to identify the optimum long-term asset management plan to deliver a particular level of service, whatever that level of service is that you're adopting. And there needs to be reiterative, continuous improvement. So the framework that we developed, it's a simplified generic asset management for social housing. And we intended it to be used with these two documents, which is the International Infrastructure Management Manual, which is produced by the Institute of Public Works and Engineering Australasia, who have been amazing in driving asset management globally. But that's a general guide to asset management. Their associated group, NAMS, National Asset Managers, have developed a property manual. So very specific to property. There is at least one social housing case study in there, but there is a real need to drop down another level and to have something which is very specifically for social housing. And the framework we've developed is the first stage for organisations being able to do that. These two guides incorporate the International Standards Organisation's asset management standards, which is driving excellence around the globe. So I've got a number of figures in here to help you understand, because it's about process. It's about content and it is about process. So there's a need for data. Asset management's very data heavy, but it's also highly dependent on a lot of decisions that have to be made. So data in at the top, decisions pushing up from the bottom. It means there is a need to actually have a roadmap about the process, and I'm going to show you that shortly. This is all going to concern the assets over the life cycle. So asset creation, whether that's development or acquisition, while the asset is held, so that asset management and asset disposal, whether it's renewed or whether it's sold off. And there's, as you can see, quite a long list of the types of things that would need to be considered at each point in that life cycle. So here's the asset roadmap, and this has been adapted from the IIMM. It's very difficult for you to see all that text there, but the takeaway point is that it is a process. There's stages of decision, and there'll be a lot of going backwards and forwards. And so in this case, you're getting all the way down to the bottom. You might have said what you want, for example, establishing the levels of service. Can you afford that level of service? One of the social housing organisations we talked to set standards for the condition of dwellings, and then found after a couple of years that it was costing them a very large amount of money. So they took those out again. So effectively there was no standard, but that obviously has implications for the service that is actually delivered. So connectivity, I mentioned before that it's very interconnected, it's very data heavy. So this is to give you an indication of which systems and processes are connected to what. So, on the one hand, you really need geospatial information. You need to understand the rent roll. All these things are connected, and these all require software. Typically, they're all in different software. So you need software that talks to each other. Ideally and increasingly, software exists to help social housing organisations, so they're fully integrated, enabling whoever it is in the organisation that requires the understanding can pull that data out. So the example would be, suddenly there's an opportunity for redevelopment. You want to understand, what the optimal decision will be. Do you knock down something you've got, or do you go acquire something? What would be better? You need to be able to pull that out of your systems. So the type of forward planning that needs to occur is to allow an organisation to match the financial resources it has to the needs of the assets. So what's happened in many social housing systems is investment tends to go in waves or is very lumpy. And while it's great that, for example, with the economic stimulus, we're going to get a whole lot of new assets because there's a lot of redevelopment or development occurring, what it means is your profile will be a bit like this. You're going to have this big bulge at some point in the future when you need to renew that asset or replace that asset, or even a portfolio of assets that you've acquired in the present time. You need to be able to forecast to ensure there's going to be revenue sufficient. And if revenues are not sufficient, decisions will have to be made about what's going to occur, whether those assets will then have to be sold. But being able to plot this out, and in asset management, you do that up to 100 years because we have these assets are very long lived. So in terms of what we found about what's occurring within the social housing sector in Australia, well, there's lots of non-news here, so to speak. Our sector is seriously constrained in its ability to maintain, renew and configure stock to meet current need and future demand. There's way more demand than there are houses available, but there's a huge maintenance backlog, for example. And what's driving that? Well, it's inadequate revenue. It's those income-based rents are insufficient, arguably to maintain stock, certainly cannot provide the capital required to build new stock or renew stock. And this is most acute within the public housing sector, and that's reflecting the age and the size of those sectors. Community housing in Australia is a relatively young sector, and the a reflection of that is the housing tends to be much newer. But those questions about renewal have already emerged within the community housing sector. There's a very big need to develop asset management skills and knowledge. So this is not just in terms of officer level, but on boards in the community housing sector as well. Many of the smaller organisations didn't have any skills at that level, and their managers were quite critical of that because it led to suboptimal decision making. But even within our Tier 1 community housing providers, people often thought that having someone who knew about development was all that was needed, and that's not quite right. An asset manager will be thinking about what's the life cycle cost of this asset, not merely how do you get it, on the ground for as cheap as possible. So we'd be recommending that organisations take a closer look at their governance structures. There is it would be highly desirable if there was cooperative investment within asset management systems across both community housing and social housing, public housing. One of the most interesting findings I found was that long tenor debt in the community housing sector was actually driving good asset management. But of course, these organisations had to have good asset manager in order to obtain this funding anyway. Whenever a financier has exposure to the assets, they're much more concerned about the condition of those assets. And thinking about that connectivity mapping, they really want to know everything about your organisation because it's a huge risk for them. If you don't know how you're doing asset management, then they don't know just how bad the risk might be for them. So that's, I think, a very interesting finding. We would recommend that there be a single uniform independent regulatory system for all social housing. So at the present time, community housing is independently regulated. Our public housing systems are reliant on a traditional Westminster system of ministerial accountability, and that's really not delivering. We don't have, for example, dwelling standards. There's minimums which are in the Residential Tenancies Act. Many states don't have actually any dwelling standards in their residential tenancies legislation, and these are not then independently determined by a social housing organisation. So the consequence is, within a public system in particular, there's a lot of very substandard housing. So we couldn't say that the current system of regulation is really there for tenants, but there's also the broader public investment that's in social housing. We found certainly that independent regulation of community housing drove improvements in asset management, and we'd really like to see the twin incentives from regulation, but also financing, be able to be applied into the public sector. If the public sector had ability to borrow in its own right, that kind of private market discipline would be applied, and it would drive better outcomes. We need a single, much better resourced housing registrar. We've got multiple registrars around the country, with two states which effectively they opted out, but they're kind of in there at the same time. A single one would be really good because some of our community housing providers are actually national. They operate in multiple states. The Tier 1 community housing regulation is very good, but the lower tiers 2 and 3, 4, depending on the state, we really felt that needed much more focus on the asset management. The argument is, well, they have less tenants and they have less assets, so they can just kind of fumble around. and fumbling around is actually what they're doing. So we would argue those assets are at risk, and effectively the tenants are also at risk. So there needs to be consideration of what that actually means. And my suggestion would be that some questions need to be asked about some more consolidation within the community housing sector. The tier 1 providers are coming into a maturity stage, and they really need to be given more autonomy to do their asset management, to do things like recycle assets. So when state governments hand over public assets, a stock transfer situation, often they'll put a director's interest on the title. That kind of thing can go. There's a housing to legislate, to regulate the providers. So they don't need these sort of extra forms of regulation, because at the moment the hands are a bit tied, a bit too tied to get the optimal decisions and the best use of the resources available. Transfers and management leases, there needs to be some thinking about that. Some of those transfer programs have been, aimed at transferring liabilities. That should not be the intention of the policy. There needs to be, often those public systems didn't have information on those assets as well. So there's real problems with the transfer programs. But the management leases also need to kind of come up to, what I would call, 21st century sort of regulation around, what is the purpose of the lease? What are we trying to do with those leases? And maybe so just more transfer would be a more optimal situation. And that's it. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Andrea. We really appreciate that. It was great to hear such a clear presentation of the research, and thank you for that. Before we discuss it together, I'm now going to hand over to Jess Pomeroy, and she's going to give a bit of a reflection and response on the presentation. And just to remind people who've joined us late, perhaps Jess is joining us from the Community Housing Industry Association in Victoria. Thanks, Jess.
Thanks, Tom. And thanks, Andrea. That was a really great presentation. I was really excited to be asked to speak to this project. I know asset management has come up quite a lot in the community housing sector in Victoria. And I was looking forward to sort of delving in and seeing how we could use this great research. And I think Andrea and her colleagues have done a really good job of capturing the challenges facing social housing organizations, whether that be public housing departments or community housing organizations, as well as some potential opportunities to improve practice. And I thought, I have too many ideas and not enough time, so I'm going to focus on just a few points in my response and acknowledge that there's more that I would love to say if I had more time. So the two key points that I really wanted to focus on were that issue of insufficient funding, and then the question around ownership structures and management and transfer programs. So Andrea's point, I think anyone working in the social housing sector would agree there's never going to be enough money coming in out of income-based rents to support the kind of holistic, whole-of-life asset management framework that Andrea and her research colleagues have recommended. So as much as there's some amazing suggestions in there and a really lovely framework and structure, the ability of, for example, Victorian community housing organizations who are members of CHIA Vic to be able to take that framework and go, right, this is our 5-year work plan. They just won't be able to do it without a complete restructure of the funding model. And that's not a comment on Andrea's work. I think she's got some really great information in there. It's a comment on how social housing is funded in Australia, and the range of diverse interests that look at it and say, well, it's providing a social benefit, but we're not going to fund it in recognition of that. So I think there's a real challenge there in how we fund social housing. But I also think there's probably not a huge amount of political will for the Commonwealth government to put additional subsidies in, whether that's increasing Commonwealth rent assistance or introducing new programs. And so I think that for the sector is a real challenge to think through. So how do we get enough funding in to implement a whole of life strategy towards our asset management systems? And I have a couple of ideas on that I'm going to come back to in a minute. because I did want to be positive with this response. The other challenge, I think, is around the ownership structures, and really that question of how far into the asset creation and the asset disposal conversation can an organization go if they don't own the asset. So the director's interest that Andrea referenced on owned properties is obviously a challenge around disposal. But if you're a community housing organization that's managing properties on a lease, whether that's 5 years like it currently is in Victoria, or a longer sort of 20-year lease like they have in other jurisdictions, you have little to no say in the acquisition part of the conversation. So what the quality is when you receive that property, even if it's new, was not something you had a say into. And similarly, you don't have much options in terms of disposal. So if you're a small provider that's managing a portfolio that's entirely made up of leased stock, your options for disposal might be to hand it back to the department and then have one for your property in your portfolio. And so it comes down to this real tension between the mission of the organization, which is to house low-income households, versus the ongoing cost of maintaining this asset, which potentially, if it's reaching the end of its usable life, is becoming more and more and more expensive. And I think that's something that, as charities and not-for-profits with this really fundamental desire to house low-income households, it's really hard for them to say, it's not in our best interest to keep this property anymore, when they don't have any idea of how they would source a new one to replace it. So I think that's a real struggle in terms of expanding the community housing sector, in particular, to this whole of life strategic framework. Is how do we think through leases or transfer programs or any other arrangements where the asset is not owned by the community housing organization, so that we are creating opportunities for them to feed into that acquisition conversation, whether it's a conversation about materials to reduce ongoing maintenance, or whether it's a bigger conversation about location, orientation, design. And then how do we think through the end of that lease, transfer, whatever program it is, so that we're not creating this really tough rock and a hard place conversation within the organization that says, well, do we house fewer people, or do we just keep pouring money into this hole? So I think those are the two real issues. And that being said, I think there's a lot of really great stuff that Andrea and her colleagues have pointed to around the need for increasing professionalization in the asset management space, the real challenges around technology. And I know CHIA is doing some work to try and identify what are the options that are available and how do they talk to other IT systems, because sometimes even that information for smaller organizations can be hard to get your hands on. But I said I wanted to have a bit of a positive element to my comment, my response. And I think as much as I struggle to see Commonwealth coming to the table anytime soon with sort of the blank check and saying, sure, we'll fix the problem, I think there's a real opportunity with the conversations we're having about climate change and this drive to reach carbon zero. And I think it could be an opportunity for government to look at this challenge, which is, we've got however many billion homes across Australia. We know that the vast majority of them are inefficient and are potentially exposed to a range of different climate-related risks. So how are we going to get from that portfolio of housing to something that's much better suited to climate change and potentially mitigating climate change effects? And I think there's an opportunity if government wanted to, and certainly some of the state governments are already making moves in this space. But I think if we could get sort of a unified approach from the Commonwealth all the way down, we could really get some momentum here. To look at the social housing system and say, look, this is going to be how we create system change and how we create the industry that supports retrofits of our housing stock across Australia. So if we invest in doing those climate-related retrofits or redevelopments or disposals and purchasing properties that are in less climate risky areas, then not only can we be creating really great outcomes for our most vulnerable households, we can also be driving enough volume in this retrofit space to create an industry that can support, private owners, commercial owners to start undertaking these activities as well. So this is me looking in a crystal ball and guessing, but I think that climate change might actually be the lever that we can use to crack open that conversation about the quality of our housing stock, start getting some more funding into the system, at least for the existing housing that we have, and potentially also having conversations about what does it cost to maintain, what does it cost to acquire and build the stock of social housing across Australia, and is this really working for us?
Thanks, Jess. We appreciate those reflections that you've given us. I want to, before I start asking questions that have come in from the audience, to give Andrea, I guess, a chance to respond to some of the issues that you've raised, Jess, in your reflection. So, Andrea, do you want to respond to any of the points that Jess has made first?
I would agree, wholeheartedly that trying to go to zero carbon is a very significant opportunity for the sector, and the role that social housing could play in the transformation of housing in Australia, to be that leader where things get tested, because in the private market there are all sorts of barriers why it won't come through the private sector. So I think that's what government needs to appreciate, is that it can demonstrate, it can trial all the kinds of systems and changes that are required through the public housing and community housing sectors, and delivering the benefits directly in those sectors, as well as this broader economic and environmental benefit. I think that's so true. Yeah. And it's the sustainability is one of those key external conditions that social housing organisations have to take account of. Even if they didn't want to, they have to. Like if we go back to 2009 in Victoria, we had more heat-related deaths than we did have fire-related deaths, and it's about the condition of our housing. That it can't cope with increasing temperatures associated with climate change. So it's a very real need within our social housing sector, where there's people are far more vulnerable, like they're much more likely to have health-related issues, which make them particularly vulnerable to something like heat stress, let alone those who are in places which are vulnerable, such as North Queensland or coasts, or in bushland areas.
But I would just like to emphasize it requires investment. So just saying to your, the public housing body or the community housing sector, well, you can do this, just go off and make it happen, it's just not going to happen. The funding has to be there to support that aspiration.
It absolutely. I mean, and the funding needs to happen. I mean, this is the thing. We've got this massive liability, and if reinvestment doesn't happen at this time, then our social housing system is going to shrink very dramatically. So that's the big risk, that we are currently losing lots of stock because we're not renewing it faster than it's depreciating. So, the writing is on the wall. So there needs to be a massive reinvestment, and that investment needs to take account of the future.
Okay, thank you both. Andrew, just a quick question of clarification first. The research that you did, it looked at every state and territory in Australia, is that right?
Yes, so there was a national survey, and in terms of the workshop participants and the interviewees, they came from right across the country.
Mm-hmm. And was there any, or where did you look, I guess, internationally for best practice inspiration?
Well, excuse me. Interestingly, as asset management, as an academic interest, there was quite a lot of work done by some of our European colleagues 15 years ago, but there's actually been very little sustained interest in the social housing sector and its asset management, and trying to find, what are organisations actually doing. It's not that obvious when you're doing a desk-based research, trying to find out what's happening there. So in terms of the Australian literature, there's very little. There was some previous AHURI work 10 years ago, but really very, very little work in Australia.
We've had a few questions come in around the issue of rent, a few different types of questions, but I'm just wondering, I might, Andrea, first again turn to you and get you to expand a little further, and then also, I guess, get some feedback from Jess. But we've had one comment, Andrea, that related to the diagram that you showed about the framework. I guess wanting to understand a bit better where rent fits into that model, And then another comment here around obviously the community housing sector having access to the federal assistance there that is not necessarily available to the the state housing providers. Again, how does that factor into your model in relation to the two components of the system?
Okay, so in terms of the rent, so thinking of that sandwich in that figure, so that would be at the top. So that's your data. So if you know there's, if you're housing singles in Australia, a single person, say on a new start, so an unemployment benefit, it is incredibly low. So if you were to forecast out that amount over, matching the rent to the actual asset, you know that you're going to have a severe deficit on that dwelling while you have that tenant. You could change and have a different tenant in there, someone who perhaps is receiving, say if it's a 2-bedroom apartment, for example, you might end up with someone who's got a child in there. So the amount of income they have is going to be higher, which means the amount of rent coming into the organisation is going to be higher. So that data requirement is about plotting out who do you think your tenants are going to be, and then you have, and there's what your mission will be, but there's also what rental incomes can those different types of tenant attract, and that probably will have some necessity for working out some cross subsidies between tenants. Although we have some community housing organisations which they specialise in particular groups who are particularly low income. Like if your focus is on young people, 16 or 17-year-olds, they have almost no income. The statutory incomes that they're given, youth allowances, are so low, it wouldn't even cover their lunches really. So the organisation has to undertake some kind of fundraising to get the funds in order to have operational revenues and costs covered, let alone doing any development or acquiring new stock. So that's why that sandwich is there. You've got to have this data. You've got to understand what income you're going to have, but you've got to be making decisions about which tenants are you going to have, because there has implications for how much revenue you'll have. Whereas in some other systems that wouldn't occur because the central government would be providing a compensating mechanism. So so your costs are always covered, but not in Australia.
Thanks. Did you want to add anything to that, Jess? Or I know you covered some of that already in your earlier comment.
Yeah, I would echo what Andrea says, but I mean, to really dumb it down, and I can't speak with confidence about how the public housing departments work, but certainly in the community housing sector, by and large, the only income you have to cover your day-to-day operations is your rents. So as Andrea says, if you're talking about a percentage of the income of someone that's getting a Centrelink benefit, it's not a lot of money. It could be, $5,000, $7,000, $10,000 a year. That not only has to cover all of the maintenance of the property, it has to cover your rates, it has to cover insurance, it has to cover the operation of the community housing organization. So it's also covering your tenancy manager costs, it's covering your CEO and your executive. Yeah. Everything comes out of the cost of rents. And so when we say that there's not enough funding in the system to drive this level of strategic asset management, we're fundamentally saying the challenge is the rents aren't high enough. Nobody is prepared to increase rents for vulnerable tenants. So we're not saying we want to raise rents. What we're saying is we need an injection of capital into the system that's not just, here's $2 million to build new units, but you have to figure out how to maintain them and renew them at the end of their life, because this is all you're getting from us. And the other comment that I wanted to make was just around that question of Commonwealth rent assistance. We love saying that the community housing sector can attract Commonwealth rent assistance, and it absolutely does make a difference. But I had a quick look at the figures, and for the sort of largest household paying the highest level of rent, the highest amount of Commonwealth rent assistance they can attract is still under $200 a fortnight. That's less than $5,000 a year. So in the grand scheme of things, like $5,000 is still not going to cover a whole lot of asset management, much less other services and assistance that you might be looking to provide to that renter. So,
and it's worth saying for our international audience today is that our Commonwealth rent assistance is not indexed. So it hasn't been rising to the same extent that rents generally are rising. So it's well below. And a lot of the statutory benefits like New Start don't rise either.
Andrea, picking up your comments about a single housing registrar, I'd like to throw that across to Jess and see if she has any thoughts on that particular question. And I guess, you know, in line with the focus of today's discussion, specifically in relation to asset management, how do you see, do you agree with that recommendation of Andrea and her colleagues' report? And also then, you know, how do you see that helping in terms of your asset management?
I think everyone would agree that having a single regulatory system instead of the sort of three that are currently operating in Australia would be much simpler. And certainly our members that are operating in multiple jurisdictions would agree and would say that having to comply with different regulatory systems adds an additional administrative burden to them. There probably was a bit of a missed opportunity with the review of the national regulatory system, because I know before that kicked off, Victoria was quite interested in seeing how that panned out. At the moment, the regulatory system in Victoria has, I'm going to get yelled at, but I'm going to say it anyways. We would argue that it has probably a higher level of regulation and sort of oversight of the registered agencies than perhaps the national system does. And that was one of the big reasons why the Victorian government was waiting to see what the review would do, because if they could raise the standard of the national system so that it covered off on the same levels of oversight that the Victorian system did, then I think there would have been more interest in Victoria to opt into that national regulatory system. But because the review didn't end up making any fundamental changes to national regulation, Victoria has chosen not to opt in. I certainly can't speak for any governments on this one, but if I were to speculate, I would speculate that it has to do with sort of how do they protect assets that they've invested in a national system. So, and I would imagine that that will be the problem across the board. So even with a national system, even if all states opted in, I think you would still have some tensions between state interests versus a national organization. So there's definitely value in it, but getting there, I think, is trickier than we might think.
Thanks for that. Andrea, did you have anything more you wanted to add to that? I know you covered it fairly comprehensively in your talk, so probably.
I think there's the concern by governments about protecting their investment. I think, you know, we now have a system that's kind of coming into maturity, particularly for the tier ones. Governments put lots of investment into lots of organisations, charities, but also private sector organisations where they don't have the same kind of mechanisms to protect their investment. There's something specific about it where they think they need to. And I would argue they no longer need to do that, that they have this system of regulation that they've created. They have housing legislation. They can let go. They need to let it perform the way it's able to perform if some of those constraints are taken off. So I think it's about maturity in policy making as well.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, all these organisations, you know, are established as charities. You know, it's that they're regulated by other regulators as well.
Exactly.
So,
yeah.
It's not like they're going to suddenly siphon money off overseas and all take a big holiday. That will never happen. They're very mission-driven organisations who also need to be accountable to the community, because the community is also directly investing in these organisations as well. Because the flip side is the kind of accountability that community housing providers are expected to provide is not reflected in the public systems, where there's very little accountability at all. And it's it's the largest part of our sector. So there needs to be a lot of attention into regulating that part of the social housing system.
Sticking with the public housing component of the social housing system then, Andrea, for a moment. In proposing a social housing asset management framework, obviously governments hold lots of assets, and not just public housing, but schools, hospitals, and a whole range of other many range of things. And what I'm interested in asking about is how you see, the social housing system or the public housing system rather, interacting with that broader portfolio of assets that an individual government holds. For example, you mentioned the social housing, the most valuable component of that is the land. From a government's perspective, that's part of a whole range of land that a government holds, and that it can potentially use for a range of different uses. Can I get you to comment a little bit about, the intersection there? Because strategic asset management framework is very likely to sit at a treasury level, or in a public works department, perhaps in those states that have one of those, where they're actually concerned not just with the social housing system, but with the whole range of government assets, and how government is using or getting the best value from its portfolio as a whole. How do you see that perhaps impacting on the operation of a social housing asset management framework, and what might be some of the issues that come up there?
Certainly, there was it's a global shift that occurred sort of around the 1990s. After that long World War II boom, and there was a huge amount of investment by governments, and of course, whatever those assets were, they started to age. And social housing, amongst them. So yes, governments have been extremely interested in making sure that there is strategic asset management. And so that's all really good. I think the problem with the social housing sector is the departments tend to, because it's about welfare, those departments are often getting, they get restructured pretty often. So I think there's a lot of turnover that happens. Where does the asset management end up? Who has carriage for it within those organisations? And trying to get the right skills and the right knowledge into a system, and having that sort of that systems thinking as a part of the entire what the organisation does. I think it's been really challenging for many of our public housing authorities in Australia, because there's been a lack of continuity of policy, and and they're facing all these budget constraints. Unlike community housing, they can't capture Commonwealth rent assistance, so they're actually more impoverished. It's not that they're getting budget allocations every year to keep them up to speed, so they're shrinking systems. And so their asset managers are doing an amazing job, trying to keep the place held together with Band-Aids, really. And that's a reflection of broader government policy setting. Where does asset management sit in there? I mean, that top-down should be putting a lot of pressure into those systems. But I think there's so many kind of structural problems sitting within social housing that it makes it really hard for that policy direction to really take, to grow very deep roots to obtain the kind of asset management that you'd want. I mean, at least 3 states that, we talked to, 3 of them have just been through big restructures again, turning them back into super departments or pulling apart super departments. That kind of change, there's been a lot of it, and they lose people, they lose knowledge, and everyone laughs, but they all know it's true that they don't know what actual assets they have. It's that bad that they don't know they've got houses, or they don't know they've got these houses where they've leased them out to some other organisation. So that's common in many states.
Can I ask a question now, which has come up in a couple of questions that we've had come through around scale, and can also relate that perhaps to some comments that you made, Andrea, in your talk about density as well. You posited that the low density of Australian cities and the large overall land mass of Australia made asset management difficult, that was one of the aspects of the challenge here. Can you, I guess, elaborate on, I guess, why that constitutes a challenge? And can you also, I guess, pick up on the question of scale? You know, to what extent does the size of the portfolio improve or worsen the chances of good asset management, or how does it relate to, I guess, the framework that you've posited here?
So thinking of urban Australia and how low density that is, if you think of a community housing organisation, maybe they've got 100 houses, perhaps they've historically started in a particular part of a city, but because capital money gets thrown out every so often, everyone grabs the money as it comes by. They tend to ignore their strategic plans and just go for the money because it's there. So it's opportunistic. So, we found organisations would suddenly have one single house, one single development that would be 75 kilometres away from their base. So think about the costs of sending out your maintenance teams all that distance just to service one thing. A hinge needs to be replaced on a door or something. That's a lot of cost. Whereas there could be a community housing organisation actually in that suburb that, if they had the house, it would make much more sense. They could get 10 houses fixed in that afternoon. So all those little costs, they really add up. And some of our organisations talked about the kind of subcontracting that they were doing to get around those kinds of issues. But, subcontracting also has costs attached to it. So if they are, more locationally based, it will reduce costs of, physically sending people out to sites to do things. It also means they know the neighbourhood really well. So they know, what potential redevelopment will work, what might not work, that type of local knowledge, rather than spreading themselves very, very thin.
And Jess, there's a lot of variation in scale amongst the providers in your network. Can you comment on that scale question and how that interacts with or impacts on asset management practices and so forth?
Yeah, sure. Definitely true that the scale of community housing organization varies wildly. So we've got some members that are managing sort of 20 or 30 properties, which are very geographically very close to one another, versus organizations that are operating and managing properties across Australia. And so certainly not to the same degree perhaps that the public housing departments are facing, but some of those large members are having the same sorts of challenges around identifying tradies and whatnot in the various areas they're operating. I think one of the things that we're hoping to do as a peak body is see if we can distill some resources from Andrea's work that helps bring some of those smaller organizations tools that they can use to refine their asset management practices. I mean, the reality is, if your business is managing 30 properties, you probably have one person, maybe two part-time workers. And so the ability of them to be across all of the different elements of managing the business, as well as developing a real depth of understanding of asset management, is a big ask and can be quite challenging. So, I think that's a live question for us. Is there something that maybe our smaller members need to look at around sharing asset management expertise that would give them that benefit of knowledge, but maybe wouldn't require them to devote so much of an FTE to that particular task? I think there's real value in the diversity of size, and the small organizations are often the ones that are most embedded in the local community and are most engaged with the community, understand what's going on, understand local trends and issues. So I'm really hesitant to say that consolidation of organizations is going to deliver benefits, because I think it will also deliver losses in terms of that community connection and real neighborhood presence. So I think for me, the question is, how do we create a way of consolidating the knowledge and sharing asset management expertise and resources and contractors, I don't know, in a way that allows us to maintain that small scale of operation, but achieve the sophistication that is just not possible on one or two part-time employee.
All right, I want to shift the conversation now to a slightly different topic, which is the question, I guess, of social investment and the fact that these are not just assets that are existing to perform in terms of getting a return. These are programs that are delivering outcomes for people. And Andrea, in your first slide, I think it was, you did acknowledge that fact. And I'm just wondering how, in a practical way, that is actually factoring into planning for and thinking about asset management. What are, I guess, some of the specific implications, and how actually sophisticated is the system in actually addressing that dimension in the social housing system, as you say, is different to a commercial property portfolio. So do we still have a way to go towards actually designing an asset management framework that properly accounts for that? Where are we at in that process?
Best practice asset management is very sophisticated about this issue, because the starting point is, what is the mission of your organisation, and the user. If we think of it, asset management in a generic sense, but in our case, it's the tenant. The entire asset management should swing around the tenant as the user of this asset, and housing is a service. So the purpose of that asset is to deliver a housing service, and that's what the managers and governance level of the organisations need. They need to be doing it. The asset management system needs to do that, but actually that's what they need to be doing. So when I was highlighting the lack of dwelling standards, that's a level of service. So if you're going to deliver for tenants, you have to deliver levels of service against a very large range of domains. Dwelling standards are one of them. So the organisation makes that choice. They have to make a whole series of choices, and they will inevitably do trade-offs. So it's up to them to make that decision about what is the more important thing. What's happening for us in Australia is that trade-off is trading off dwelling conditions against dwelling quantity. People are saying better to have more dwellings because there's so much need than to have the dwellings we have to be an acceptable condition. I mean, there's been surveys that have been done which show that there's a worrying level of houses that have multiple structural defects. So, and that's more common in housing for Indigenous peoples than it is for other Australians. So, but it's up to the organisation. It's not which asset management system you have. It's how what the choices that the organisation is actually going to make about what they're going to deliver.
But they're doing that in a very constrained environment. So it's not a best case scenario. This is the level of service that we will deliver to our tenants. It's on the shoestring budget that we have. This is the best that we can do. And I think one of the challenges is that the value of social housing isn't reflected even in that sort of capital grant acquisition phase often. So, and obviously I'm speaking from the community housing perspective, but when the community housing sector is applying for capital grants and they're sort of pitching a development proposal, it's very unclear the degree to which the social value of this housing and the offsetting impact that it will have on health and justice and the range of other government programs is taken into account. And so often you get the sense that it's being evaluated in comparison to private market housing. Private market housing, take the example of the big housing build right now. The government has said we want to see high levels of energy efficiency. We want to see really good passive design. We want to see accessibility. We want to see connection with community. And so there's all of these additional add-ons that are going to make for fabulous developments. And I'm really excited to see what we get at the end of the big housing build. But they also add cost, not just to the design phase necessarily, but to the ongoing sort of operation and maintenance. And so I think as a society, we need to really be looking at how government is assessing new development of social housing and make sure that it's reflecting the value that it's creating for society. And I think we also need to be asking the question of why is it that funding is only usually available for new stuff? Because usually, Andrea was saying organizations are choosing more units instead of, better maintenance on their existing units, but sometimes they can only get money for new. They can't get money for current. And so it's a choice, but it's not a choice because, they're a business.
Yeah, well, they're a business, but I think, this is what the policy dilemma is, that organisations look for it, growth money is there, so they grab it. But policymakers need to understand these organisations are not looking back at the liability that sits right behind them. So these units might need replacing right now, but they can't replace them. They want, they'll go and acquire more, which creates a new liability for them. So it's government that also needs to understand this. Certainly the people who run public housing, they understand this. It's the policy making level of government that needs to appreciate it. And at least, the Victorian government did recently at the beginning of the pandemic open up lots of, funding for maintenance, specifically
Absolutely.
to acknowledge the huge backlog that exists. But that backlog in the public housing system is huge, really huge. And houses are being lost all the time. So how do those managers deal with that? They have to rely on redevelopments where land or sites are lost. They ask the private developers to come in and redevelop housing estates, and basically selling off some of the stock in order to have funds at all to replace the stock that has fully depreciated. So and that's not an optimal outcome when we have the need for new stock, for increased amounts of stock.
So I'm curious, Andrea, do you think that community housing organizations should not be looking to grow their portfolios? If that's where the only money is, are you saying that you should not grow and you should sort of sit back and figure out how to maintain your assets? Or
I'd say if I was a board member, remembering the board members have liabilities themselves, I would be wanting to have levels of service standards which are explicit, so that the board has to make explicit decisions, understanding what the ramifications of those decisions are. So yes, they all want to grow, and that's understandable. And it's, that government money, that truck passes by and they all run after it. I understand why they do it, but they do need to sit down and say, well, what are our liabilities for our existing, not just the existing stock, but for our existing tenants? What standard of housing do we want them to be living in? What do we forego? What's happening there that we're not delivering, that we could be delivering? That they have to ask themselves the question. They have to go through that decision-making process. And I think what's happening is that process is not happening. And that's what they need to do. Only they can answer that question. I can't answer the question, but each organisation has to answer the question for themselves.
Right, thank you. Can I also ask now, we've had a few questions around the intersection between asset management and tenancy management. And I might turn to Jess first on this one, put you on the spot. Are you able to comment at all, I guess, on that that particular intersection, and are you aware of what the issues are there? Anything you'd like to say about that?
Asset management and tenancy management. I mean, that's really where the rubber meets the road, right? Like, that's really the day-to-day challenges of running a social housing business, is how do you balance the needs and aspirations of your current tenants with a long-term vision for your portfolio and the needs and wants of future tenants in a constrained funding environment. So, I mean, I feel like almost I want more context on the question to be able to say
that's
anything.
fine. Yeah. I'll flip it across to Andrea. I'm really just looking at that question around asset management and tenancy management, and it's something that I guess has come up a fair bit. I guess as housing first approaches have become more common, and we've had development that has looked to, I guess, achieve a more complete separation of those two. Yet, of course, asset management influences tenancy management and vice versa. So, how does, to Andrea, then how does your framework engage with that question?
If you have an organisation that's delivering both, that's ideal. When you split those two things, it actually becomes harder. Get back to that connectivity map. Those two systems need to be working hand in glove. Good tenancy management can alert asset management to issues, to avert future costs. If you have a really difficult tenant, often those tenants they damage property, so they create costs. But good tenancy management can reduce that. But conversely, a little bit of responsiveness in terms of maintenance, like giving that person a little bit, so they can invest themselves into their house, can also reduce future maintenance costs. So it's how to bring those two systems together, which I think we have a bit of a legacy within our social housing systems of them being very separate systems. And I think, tenancy side, that voice, I think, has been strong. I don't think asset managers have been very strong, I think they're considered perhaps, these terrible people over there who deny us, who won't come out and fix things or that type of thing. But that's not how it should work. That they really should be highly integrated systems. So, think if, you have a general manager for one and a general manager for the other, they should be coming together as a team along with the finance person, so that they all understand each other's roles and needs, because it's the organisation's needs, not just that specific function.
Jess, did you have anything more to say on that now, or have you you're done?
It's a sort of taking a step back, but one of the things that our members often say is that there's this expectation on community housing organizations, and I think the same is probably true of public housing departments, that you will go above and beyond and deliver a really high level of supportive tenancy management, asset management for your vulnerable clients. And they're not funded to deliver those services. In fact, they receive less funding than a comparable private real estate agency. So I think everything Andrea is saying about the need for those systems to work together is true, but I think we also have this challenge of public expectations about what a social housing landlord will do that aren't matched with funding. And so it can be challenging to navigate that environment in a way that keeps all of the stakeholders happy.
All right. Andrea, just a comment then around the, I guess, a diversity of approaches around the country that you saw as you looked at this project, and are we seeing, I guess, a divergent? Are approaches diverging, or are you seeing the opposite, or is it everyone's doing their own thing in their own state, and there's not much interaction. What are you seeing in terms of, I guess, cross-fertilisation or different paths?
The story was very consistent across the country. The public housing systems, not a lot's changed since our colleagues did their report about 10 years ago. And across the public system, there was diverse understandings and knowledge, and that remains the same. 10 years ago, the community housing sector was very, very tiny, so they weren't able to report on that. Community housing around Australia is very diverse. I mean, as Jess was saying, we have large multi-state providers, and we have tiny organisations who might manage a single house. And what that means for the asset management practices is that they are very, very diverse. But there's certainly, with the increasing size of community housing, there's that increasing professionalisation that's occurred. And they're getting their systems together. They're heavily investing into software, but it's still very diverse. You'll have organisations. If you manage 20 houses, just using a spreadsheet, will work for you. Trying to manage all your asset management on a spreadsheet, with more than 50 houses, it's going to become incredibly challenging, though some people think it's fine. I know organisations who were tier 1, and they had lots and lots of housing, and you just think, how do they do that? Why haven't you got the software that will allow you to do with all this? And some of that's kind of risky because it depends on the skills of the person who's got charge of that big spreadsheet. So it's about lifting it out of a specific person, because it's very challenging for the sector to obtain, highly skilled people. And if they move on, and that's one of the things we're seeing is there's a cohort that come and stay because they love the sector. It's about mission, but a lot of others are cycling in and out. When the property sector has a downturn, they flood into non-profit sectors. But then they'll go out again. So the systems need to be able to account for that challenge in the labour supply as well. And that's where I think embracing the kind of software and technology innovations that are occurring will help that being able to plan for a qualified, consistent workforce.
But I think that question of workforce, Andrea, extends across all elements of a community housing or public housing business, because I'm not sure if this happens in public housing, but certainly in community housing, our members kind of cannibalize each other. And so if you need a tenancy worker, there's only so many. So you tap someone on the shoulder in a neighboring organization. Yeah. And I recognize that in Victoria, we are incredibly lucky to have the big housing build. But as a peak body, we're looking at that, sort of 40% increase in stock over the next 5 to 10 years. And we're thinking, well, right now the pressure is on construction and development professionals, but it's also going to be on tenancy management. It's going to flow into the support systems that assist our clients. And so I think we need to be looking at workforce issues more broadly, and how do we attract people into the sector and retain them? Because otherwise we're just going to keep cannibalizing each other when it comes to staff, and not really building that capacity and that pipeline of workers to come in.
That's a really good point, Jess. Is that something that you looked at, Andrea, or was that outside the scope of this particular study?
The broader, definitely outside, but it's definitely true. And and they are cannibalising. People moving in and out of the public to the community sectors. Although in the public sector, salary levels are maybe not as high as private, because property industry, people do very well. But you get security when you work in government. So there's a lot of people go in there and they stay in there. So there's a lot of very dedicated people in that sector.
All right. Well, just one final question I'd like to put to you before we wind up is, I guess, around the issue of standard, quality of housing, which we've talked about at some length. But the other issue is that has come up is one around, I guess, experimentation. And I think, Jess, you mentioned that earlier. there's both the community housing sector and I would argue perhaps the public housing sector as well has actually often been a little more innovative perhaps than the private sector at different times, and has had space to do that. How do you see that role, I guess, of innovation and experimentation, and you mentioned about leading the private sector sometimes, in terms of actually I guess becoming more professional in asset management, in the two areas of the sector. How do you see that impacting on that capacity to innovate, to experiment, to try new things? Is that potentially going to be, will that appetite for doing that be dampened by a more professionalised asset management sector?
I think it's very constrained at the moment because there's not a lot of money, so you tend to do what you know rather than what you might like to do. I think there's probably appetite to do things differently, but do you get time? Do you have the funds to do that? So one of the big problems that comes out of ad hoc funding is that, the money lands. It's like a UFO lands and everyone madly rushes to get a piece of it. And in those circumstances, everyone's going flat chat. There's no time to reflect or to innovate when that happens. When the money runs out in the community housing sector, all those development teams are laid off, and we lose all those skills. And then, 10 years later, we might get another lot of money that comes. So we have to do it all over again. So it's the ad hoc nature of capital funding, which I think works against innovation. Whereas if we had that compensatory financial mechanism, the level of investment could go in so that, we have a more steady state situation, and that will give people the time and the capacity to start thinking about what really works, because there's multiple dimensions around innovation. What really works? What kind of household mix in what size developments? These are still, I think, very basic questions which we're all grappling with. Whereas the funding models tend to want, let's shove as many units on this site as we can because we've got such big demand.
Right.
So I'm not sure if we're getting the most out of our investment because of the system that we have.
Any last comment from you, Jess?
I think that the public housing and community housing sectors are really well placed to take on that work because their mission is to provide housing and to make sure that it's safe and it's comfortable and it's secure and it's contributing to those other life domains that are important to people living in the homes, but also sort of society more generally. I feel like today's conversation has been, there's just not enough money, but we could do all the good things with more money. So, I'm going to tag that again. But I also sort of pick up on Andrea's point about the maturity of the community housing sector and government potentially giving them a bit more freedom to, to spread their wings and do a bit more with the resources they have. Yes, absolutely. I think funding is necessary to support that level of innovation because it comes with risk. People that are housing the most vulnerable households in our society are not big risk takers because they know what's at stake. But I think if we could create a supportive environment, then, the social housing space is a great one to test out what works. What can we do about making more comfortable homes? What can we do about creating connection to community? All sorts of really great sort of social policy questions. We could do some really good work on if the supportive environment and the funding was there.
Okay, well, thank you. Look, thank you, Jess. Thank you, Andrea. We really appreciate your time today and what you've had to say and the discussion that we've had together. And I'd also like to thank all of you who've joined us for the webinar today for being part of it. This has been our last webinar for 2021, and we do look forward to bringing you more webinars, of course, in 2022. If you want to ensure that you get invitations to the webinars in your email, then please subscribe to AHURI News. A quick reminder then that we'd appreciate your feedback by completing the short survey that will be emailed to you today. And if you want to look at this webinar again or share it with a colleague, it will be available on the AHURI website shortly. That's it then for today, and until we see you again, whether that's online or in person, thank you so much for joining us. Goodbye.